The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees outside Lincoln Elementary School as kids shuffled into their classrooms one Monday morning. Little Lily Wong sat quietly at her desk, her dark eyes fixed on her notebook where she'd been doodling little hearts and stars. She wasn't usually excited about school assemblies, but today was different. It was career day, and her class was buzzing with energy. As various parents walked in to talk about their jobs, Lily barely looked up. That was until she heard heavy boots walking across the classroom floor. The sound made her peek up from her drawings, and that's when she saw him. Officer David Park, standing tall in his crisp blue uniform, his badge catching the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. But what really caught her attention wasn't the officer himself. It was his son who stood slightly behind him. The boy, Tommy Park, had gentle eyes and a shy smile that reminded Lily of someone, though she couldn't quite figure out who. He was wearing a navy blue sweater that seemed a size too big for him, and his hands were stuffed deep in his pockets as he rocked back and forth on his heels. There was something about him that made Lily's heart skip a beat, like finding a favorite toy she'd forgotten she had. Mrs. Rodriguez, their teacher, introduced Officer Park to the class. As he began talking about his work keeping the community safe, Lily found herself stealing glances at Tommy. He stood quietly by the whiteboard, occasionally helping his dad hold up pictures of police cars and safety equipment. Once their eyes met, and both quickly looked away, cheeks turning pink. The presentation became interactive when Officer Park started showing the kids his police gear. The whole class erupted in excitement when he demonstrated how his radio worked, making all sorts of official-sounding police calls. Even the usually quiet kids were raising their hands, eager to try on his police hat or hold his flashlight. But through all the excitement, Lily noticed that Tommy stayed in his corner, watching everyone else with a kind of quiet curiosity that matched her own. During the demonstration, something funny happened. When Officer Park asked for a volunteer to help demonstrate how to use a fingerprint kit, both Lily and Tommy raised their hands at exactly the same moment. The whole class giggled at the coincidence, but Mrs. Rodriguez noticed something interesting. They had the same excited expression, the same sparkle in their eyes. The real magic happened during snack time. While other kids crowded around Officer Park, asking more questions about police cars and handcuffs, Lily found herself walking towards Tommy, who was sitting alone at a desk near the window. She couldn't explain why, but her feet seemed to move on their own, like they knew exactly where they needed to go. "Hi," she said softly, clutching her apple juice box. "Do you like drawing?" Tommy looked up, surprised someone was talking to him. His face lit up when he saw the sketchbook tucked under her arm. "Yeah, I love drawing animals, especially dogs." "Me too," Lily exclaimed, her usual shyness melting away. "I have a whole notebook full of puppy drawings at home." They spent the rest of snack time sharing Lily's notebook, adding whiskers to each other's cat drawings, and laughing when Tommy's elephant ended up looking more like a gray balloon with legs. Time flew by so fast that both kids jumped when the bell rang for the next period. As Officer Park prepared to leave, he noticed something that made him pause. His usually reserved son was smiling and chatting with this little girl as if they'd known each other forever. There was something oddly familiar about the way she tilted her head when she laughed. It reminded him of someone, but he couldn't quite place it. Mrs. Rodriguez watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. In all her years of teaching, she'd never seen two children connect so instantly. There was something special about their interaction, something that went beyond the usual playground friendships. As she watched them say goodbye, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary story. The following weeks at Lincoln Elementary were different. The lunch break, which used to be just another part of Lily's quiet day, became something special. She'd look for Tommy in the crowded cafeteria, and somehow, he was always sitting at the same corner table, usually alone with his superhero lunchbox and a notebook full of drawings. One particularly sunny day, Lily gathered all her courage and walked over to his table, her lunch tray shaking slightly in her hands. "Can I sit here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's face brightened immediately, and he quickly moved his backpack to make space for her. As they shared their lunch that day, they discovered something amazing. "When's your birthday?" Tommy asked, taking a bite of his peanut butter sandwich. When Lily told him it was October 15th, his sandwich stopped halfway to his mouth. That was his birthday, too. They spent the next few minutes comparing notes. Both loved blueberry muffins. Both were afraid of thunderstorms. And oddly enough, both had a small birthmark behind their right ear. Their friendship grew in small, precious moments. During art class, they had secretly passed notes with tiny drawings. Tommy would sketch a puppy, and Lily would add a funny hat to it. In music class, they always ended up next to each other, even though Mrs. Lee assigned random seats every week. It was like they had invisible magnets pulling them together. The other kids started noticing too. "Look at the twins," someone joked one day during recess, pointing out how they both scrunched their noses the same way while concentrating on their drawings. Instead of getting upset, Tommy and Lily just laughed. Something about being called twins felt right, even though they didn't look exactly alike. Their teachers were puzzled by this unusual friendship. Mr. Chen, the math teacher, noticed how they'd solve problems the same way, making the same mistakes and having the same aha moments. The school librarian, Mrs. Kim, would smile when they'd both reach for the same book at the same time, their hands bumping into each other. One rainy afternoon, while they were waiting for their parents to pick them up, Tommy shared something he'd never told anyone else. Sometimes he whispered, looking at the rain hitting the windows, "I feel like something's missing. Like I lost something important, but can't remember what it is." Lily's eyes widened because she'd felt the same way for as long as she could remember. They started making up stories about why they felt so connected. Maybe they were secret agents from another planet, sent to Earth on a special mission. Or perhaps they were magic twins separated by a wizard's spell. Each story made them laugh, but deep down, they felt like they were getting closer to a truth they couldn't quite grasp. Their parents noticed changes in their children, too. Lily's mom found her usually shy daughter humming happily while doing homework. Tommy's dad, Officer Park, watched his son come out of his shell, talking excitedly about his day at school for the first time ever. One day, during lunch, Tommy pulled out a chocolate chip cookie his dad had packed. Without thinking, he broke it in half and gave part to Lily. "I don't like the edges," they said at exactly the same time, then burst out laughing. A teacher walking by stopped and stared, struck by how their laughs sounded identical. The mystery of their connection grew stronger each day. When Lily was sick and stayed home, Tommy knew something was wrong before anyone told him. When Tommy won the art contest, Lily had already drawn a congratulations card the day before, somehow certain he would win. Their classmates started calling them the twins not because they looked alike, but because they moved like mirror images of each other. They'd reach for their water bottles at the same time, sneeze simultaneously, and often finish each other's sentences without realizing it. As the weeks passed, their unusual bond became a regular part of school life. But for Tommy and Lily, each day brought new discoveries about their connection, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. Neither of them knew it yet, but their innocent friendship was about to uncover a truth that would change both their lives forever. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Wang was sorting through old papers in their attic when she found a dusty folder marked Adoption Records. She'd always been open with Lily about being adopted, but something made her pause and look through the papers again. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a faded photograph that had slipped between the documents. The picture showed a police officer's badge, partially visible in the corner of an old hospital photo. Mrs. Wang's heart skipped a beat as she remembered Officer Park from career day. The badge number in the photograph, 2487, matched exactly with the one she'd seen gleaming on his uniform that day. Downstairs, Lily was drawing in her notebook, humming softly to herself. She'd drawn two butterflies that looked almost identical, flying side by side. Mrs. Wong watched her daughter from the doorway, noticing little things she'd somehow missed before. The way Lily held her pencil, the slight tilt of her head when she concentrated, they were exactly like Tommy's mannerisms. That evening during dinner, Lily couldn't stop talking about her day with Tommy at school. "Mom, guess what? Today we both brought orange juice for lunch without planning it. And we both hate the crusts on our sandwiches, and we both think green is the best color ever." Mr. Wong exchanged glances with his wife across the dinner table. They'd noticed how their usually quiet daughter had blossomed since meeting Tommy. But now, with the discovery in the attic, everything seemed to take on a new meaning. Later that night, after Lily went to bed, Mrs. Wong pulled out her old photo albums. She found pictures of Lily as a baby in the adoption center. In one photo, barely visible in the background, was a blue blanket with the name Park stitched in the corner. Her hands shook as she realized what this might mean. The next morning at breakfast, Lily did something unusual. "Mom," she said, picking at her cereal, "I had a strange dream last night. I was in a room with white walls, and there was another baby next to me. We were holding hands." She looked confused, like she was trying to remember something important. It felt so real. Mrs. Wong almost dropped her coffee cup. She knew that sometimes memories from very early childhood could appear in dreams. Could Lily be remembering something from her time at the adoption center? At school that day, Mrs. Wong decided to stay after dropping off Lily. She watched through the classroom window as Lily and Tommy sat together during morning reading time. They held their books the same way, turned pages at the same time, and even yawned simultaneously. It was like watching the same person reflected in a mirror. During her lunch break, Mrs. Wong drove to the local library. She spent hours going through old newspapers from around the time of Lily's adoption. In a small article from 5 years ago, she found something that made her gasp. It mentioned Officer Park's wife passing away shortly after giving birth to twins. The article didn't mention what happened to the babies. On her way home, she passed by the police station. Through the window, she saw Officer Park at his desk, looking at a photograph. Even from a distance, she could see the sadness in his eyes as he touched the picture frame. It was the same look she sometimes caught on Lily's face when she thought nobody was watching. That evening, as Mrs. Wong helped Lily with her homework, she noticed more similarities between her daughter and Tommy. The way they both used their left hand to write, but their right hand to draw. How they both stuck out their tongues slightly when concentrating. These weren't just cute coincidences anymore. As she tucked Lily into bed that night, Mrs. Wong kissed her forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, my butterfly." Lily smiled sleepily and said, "You know what's funny, Mom? Tommy's dad calls him Butterfly too." Mrs. Wong sat there in the dark long after Lily fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow she would need to have a very important conversation with Officer Park. Officer Park sat at his desk in the police station, absently running his thumb over his wedding ring while reviewing some paperwork. His eyes kept drifting to the small frame on his desk, a picture of his late wife, me, taken just days before the twins were born. The memory of that time still made his heart ache. He'd been noticing things about Lily Wong that he couldn't ignore anymore. Yesterday, during the school's mini art fair, he watched as she helped Tommy clean up some spilled paint. The way she quickly organized the brushes, the careful way she wiped the table, it was exactly how Mai used to clean up her art supplies. During his lunch break, Officer Park pulled out an old baby album he kept locked in his desk drawer. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A hospital photo taken the day the twins were born. Two tiny babies, wrapped in identical yellow blankets, their little hands reaching for each other even then. His vision blurred with tears as he noticed something he'd missed before. The baby on the left, the one he'd had to give up, had the same tiny dimple on her chin that he'd spotted on Lily when she laughed. That afternoon, While patrolling near the school, he parked his police car and watched the children during recess. Tommy and Lily were sitting under a big oak tree, sharing a pack of colored pencils. They both held their pencils the same unusual way, pinched between their middle finger and thumb, just like Ma used to do. A memory suddenly hit him like a wave. The day at the adoption center, he'd been so overwhelmed with grief and responsibility that everything felt like a blur. But now he remembered a kind-faced woman with warm eyes wearing a bright red sweater. Could that have been Mrs. Wong? The thought made his hands shake on the steering wheel. Later that day, during dinner with Tommy, his son asked an unexpected question. "Dad, why do I sometimes feel like I'm missing something really important?" Tommy pushed his peas around his plate, looking troubled. "It's like when you lose a tooth and your tongue keeps going back to that empty space. But I don't know what's missing." Officer Park nearly dropped his fork. He'd read somewhere that twins often felt a deep connection, even when separated at birth. Could Tommy be feeling the absence of his sister without knowing it? He watched as his son absently rubbed the small birthmark behind his right ear, the same mark he remembered seeing on both babies in the hospital. That evening, while helping Tommy with his homework, Officer Park noticed his son drawing a family picture. Usually, Tommy drew just the two of them, but today there were 4 people in the picture. When asked about it, Tommy shrugged and said, "It just felt right." The girl in the drawing looked remarkably like Lily. As he tucked Tommy into bed, his son mumbled sleepily, "Dad, did you know Lily likes to sleep with her socks on too? Even in summer. Isn't that weird?" Officer Park froze. That was a quirk Mai had passed on to both babies in the hospital. The nurses had even joked about it. Sitting alone in his living room later that night, Officer Park pulled out the adoption papers he'd kept all these years. His hands trembled as he read through them again, focusing on details he'd been too heartbroken to notice before. The adoption agency's address matched with the one where he'd last seen his daughter. The dates lined up perfectly. He picked up his phone several times, wanting to call the school or the Wongs, but what would he say? How do you start a conversation that could change so many lives? As he stood by the window, watching the stars come out, he heard footsteps on his front porch. His heart jumped when he saw Mrs. Wong standing there, holding a folder that looked very much like the one on his coffee table. Through the porch screen, their eyes met, and in that moment, they both knew. The truth they'd both been circling around was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Officer Park's hands trembled as he opened the front door. Mrs. Wong stood there, clutching a folder to her chest, her eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and determination. "I think we need to talk," she said softly. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat in his living room, the tick of the old wall clock the only sound breaking the heavy silence. On the coffee table between them lay 2 folders, hers and his, both containing pieces of a puzzle they were about to solve. 5 years ago, Officer Park began, his voice barely steady, I was the happiest man alive. My wife May and I were expecting twins. He pulled out a worn hospital photo showing a beautiful woman holding 2 newborns. But then everything fell apart. May had complications after the delivery. His voice cracked, she didn't make it. Mrs. Wong reached across the table and gently touched his hand, encouraging him to continue. He took a deep breath. I was a mess. A single dad, working long shifts as a police officer, with 2 newborns to care for. I couldn't give them both the life they deserved. The hardest decision I ever made was that day at the adoption center, he continued, wiping his eyes. I thought if I kept just one baby, I could manage. I could give at least one of them a good life. But choosing which one? He couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Wong opened her folder, pulling out the photograph showing Officer Park's badge number. When I saw your badge at career day, something clicked. I'd seen this number before, in Lily's adoption papers. She paused, watching his reaction, and then I started noticing all the little things. They spent the next hour sharing observations. How both kids had the same birthmark, the same laugh, the same habit of humming while drawing. How they both twisted their hair when thinking hard. How they both loved blueberry muffins, but only ate the tops. I never told Tommy he had a sister, Officer Park admitted, guilt-heavy in his voice. I thought it would be easier that way. But sometimes he'd wake up crying, saying he felt like something was missing. And I'd find him drawing pictures of a family with 4 people instead of just us 2. Mrs. Wong nodded, understanding filling her eyes. Lily's been the same way. She's always felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing its other half. Until she met Tommy. She pulled out a recent photo of the 2 children sitting together at school, their matching smiles brightening the image. They sat in silence, letting the weight of their discovery sink in. 5 years of separation, of half-truths and missing pieces, all leading to this moment. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the room in soft orange light. What do we do now? Mrs. Wong whispered, voicing the question they were both afraid to ask. How do we tell them? Will this hurt them more than help them? Officer Park stood up and walked to the window, watching the neighborhood kids playing in the twilight. I've been protecting Tommy from the truth, thinking it was best for him. But maybe, he turned back to Mrs. Wong. Maybe they already know, in their own way. Maybe that's why they found each other. Just then, they heard the back door open, and Tommy's voice called out, "Dad, I'm home." Mrs. Lee from next door walked me back. He bounced into the living room, but stopped short when he saw Mrs. Wong. "Oh, hi, Lily's mom." Mrs. Wong smiled warmly at him, seeing now how much he looked like her daughter. Tommy's eyes darted between the 2 adults, noticing the folders and photos spread on the coffee table. "Is everything okay?" he asked, suddenly serious. Officer Park and Mrs. Wong exchanged a look. They both knew that tomorrow would change everything. They would have to find the right words, the gentle way to tell 2 children that their magical connection was more real than anyone had imagined. But for now, they just smiled at Tommy, their hearts full of hope and fear for what was to come. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but the adults' hearts were heavy with the weight of what they needed to do. Mrs. Wong had invited Officer Park and Tommy over for Saturday breakfast, thinking it might be easier to talk in the comfort of their home. Lily bounced around the kitchen, excited that her best friend was coming over. She helped her mom make blueberry pancakes, not noticing how her mother's hands shook slightly as she mixed the batter. "Can Tommy and I eat in the treehouse?" she asked, unaware of the significant conversation that was about to take place. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Tommy burst in with his usual energy, holding a drawing he made for Lily. Officer Park followed, carrying a small, worn blue baby blanket that made Mrs. Wong's breath catch. It matched the one she kept in Lily's memory box upstairs. The kids sat at the kitchen table, happily drowning their pancakes in maple syrup, while the adults exchanged nervous glances. Tommy, Lily, Officer Park began gently, "After breakfast, we'd like to talk to you both about something important." The children picked up on the serious tone. They looked at each other, doing that thing they often did, having an entire conversation without words. Mrs. Wong noticed how they both reached for their water glasses at the same time, took a sip, and set them down in perfect sync. After breakfast, they gathered in the living room. Lily and Tommy naturally sat together on the big couch, their shoulders touching. Officer Park pulled out the old hospital photo, his hands trembling slightly. "Tommy, remember how you've always felt like something was missing?" he asked softly. Tommy nodded, unconsciously leaning closer to Lily. Mrs. Wong opened a photo album on her lap, showing baby pictures of Lily at the adoption center. "And Lily, remember all those dreams you had about another baby holding your hand?" The children looked confused but interested. They glanced at the photos, then at each other, then back at their parents. Why do we have the same blanket in our baby pictures? Lily asked, pointing to the matching blue blankets in both photos. Officer Park took a deep breath. Because you're twins, he said quietly. You were born on the same day, at the same hospital. Your brother and sister. The room fell silent. Tommy's eyes grew wide as he stared at Lily. Lily's hand found Tommy's, gripping it tightly. That's why we feel the same things? Tommy whispered. That's why we both know when the other is sad. Mrs. Wong nodded, tears in her eyes. After your mom passed away, she explained gently, your dad needed help. He couldn't take care of 2 babies by himself, so Lily came to live with us. But why didn't you tell us? Lily's voice quivered, looking between her mom and Officer Park. Tommy squeezed her hand tighter, his own eyes filling with tears. We thought we were protecting you, Officer Park said, his voice full of emotion. But you two found each other anyway. You knew, somehow, in your hearts. The children sat in silence, processing this huge news. Then Tommy spoke up, his voice small but sure. That's why when I first saw Lily at school, it felt like finding something I'd lost. Like finding the other half of my heart. Lily nodded vigorously, tears rolling down her cheeks. I always felt like I was looking for someone, but I didn't know who. Until I met Tommy. She turned to her mom, worried. You're still my mom, right? I don't have to leave. Mrs. Wong quickly pulled Lily into a hug. Of course I'm still your mom, sweetheart. Nothing changes that. We just have a bigger family now. Officer Park joined the hug, pulling Tommy in too. The 4 of them sat there, holding each other, as years of separation and secrets melted away. Outside, the morning sun filled the room with warm light, as if blessing this moment of truth and reunion. In the days following the big revelation, both households went through a whirlwind of emotions. The first morning back at school, Lily and Tommy walked into class holding hands. No longer just best friends, but twins who had found each other against all odds. Their classmates noticed the change. There was something different about them, like they were glowing with a special kind of happiness. At home, Lily spent hours going through her baby photos, touching each picture gently as she discovered her past. She found herself asking endless questions about her birth mother. What was she like? She asked Mrs. Wong one evening while they were baking cookies. Her mom pulled out a photo Officer Park had shared, showing a beautiful woman painting at an easel. Your mother, Mai, was an artist, Mrs. Wong explained, smiling as Lily traced the photograph with her finger. That's why you and Tommy both love drawing so much. You got that from her. Lily hugged the photo close, finally understanding where her love for art came from. Meanwhile, at the Park household, Tommy was experiencing his own journey of discovery. He pulled out his old drawings from under his bed, dozens of pictures he'd made over the years of a girl with long dark hair. Dad, I think I was drawing Lily all along, he said, spreading the pictures across his bedroom floor. I just didn't know it was her. Officer Park sat down beside his son, picking up one of the drawings. Your mom used to say that twins share a special connection that nobody else can understand, he said softly. I guess she was right. The adults worked hard to handle the situation delicately. They arranged for both kids to see a kind child counselor who specialized in helping families like theirs. Dr. Chen helped them talk about their feelings and understand that it was okay to feel confused, happy, and scared all at the same time. One particularly emotional evening, Tommy had a meltdown during dinner. Why couldn't you keep us both? He cried, pushing his plate away. Why did you have to choose? Officer Park's heart broke as he held his son, explaining through tears how hard he tried to manage alone, how impossible it had been with his police work and no family nearby to help. But then something beautiful happened. Lily, who was having dinner with them that night, got up from her chair and hugged them both. But we found each other anyway, she said simply. And now we have 2 homes and two families who love us. The Wongs and Park started creating new traditions together. Sunday dinners became a weekly event, alternating between houses. The kids would help cook, making a mess in the kitchen, but filling both homes with laughter. They discovered that Tommy was better at flipping pancakes, while Lily had a knack for measuring ingredients exactly right. Both families worked together to create a special corner in each house for the other child. At the Wongs, Tommy got his own desk next to Lily's, decorated with his favorite superhero stickers. At the Parks, Lily had a special drawer for her art supplies and a cozy beanbag chair next to Tommy's. Some days were harder than others. Sometimes Lily would get quiet, worried that loving Officer Park meant being disloyal to Mr. Wong, the only father she'd known. And Tommy occasionally felt jealous when Lily talked about her life with the Wongs. But their parents helped them understand that love isn't like a pie with limited slices. It grows bigger to include everyone. 1 month after the revelation, during art class, their teacher, Miss Lin, noticed something remarkable. Lily and Tommy were painting at separate easels, unable to see each other's work. Yet when they finished, they'd created almost identical pictures. Two butterflies flying together in a blue sky, with a bright sun watching over them. The whole class gathered around in amazement. "How did you do that?" their classmates asked. Lily and Tommy just smiled at each other, sharing a look that said more than words ever could. They didn't need to explain. Some things, like the connection between twins, didn't need explanations. They just were. As summer approached, both families faced their first big challenge: planning the twins' upcoming birthday. They would be turning 9, and it would be their first birthday celebration together. Mrs. Wong and Officer Park sat at the kitchen table one evening, surrounded by party planning notes, both wanting to make it extra special. "What if we did something to honor Mai?" Mrs. Wong suggested gently, knowing how important it was to include the children's birth mother in their celebrations. Officer Park's eyes lit up as an idea struck him. Mai loved the butterfly garden at the city park. She always said it was where magic happened. The next day, while the kids were at school, the parents visited the butterfly garden. The morning sun filtered through the glass ceiling, making the colorful wings of hundreds of butterflies shimmer like stained glass. They knew immediately this would be the perfect place for the party. Planning the celebration brought everyone closer together. The twins worked on their invitations, drawing matching butterflies on each card. Mr. Wong, who was usually quiet and reserved, surprised everyone by offering to bake the cake. He'd been taking secret baking classes, wanting to do something special for both children. One afternoon, while helping clean out the garage, Tommy found an old paint set that had belonged to his mother. The brushes were dried and crusty, but the wooden box still smelled faintly of paint and hope. Officer Park watched as his son carefully carried it inside, treating it like treasure. "Can Lily and I fix these up?" Tommy asked, his eyes bright with purpose. "Maybe we can use Mom's brushes to paint together, just like she used to paint." That evening, the twins sat at the kitchen table, carefully cleaning each brush, while Officer Park told them stories about their mother's artwork. The day before the party, something amazing happened. The twins were helping set up decorations in the butterfly garden when a beautiful blue butterfly landed on Lily's nose. Instead of flying away, it stayed there, gently opening and closing its wings. Tommy watched in awe as another butterfly, exactly the same kind, landed on his shoulder. "Mom sent them," Tommy whispered, and Lily nodded, understanding perfectly. The garden staff said they'd never seen these rare blue butterflies before, yet here they were, drawn to the twins like magic. On the morning of their birthday, both families gathered at the garden. The sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, creating rainbow patterns on the path. Tables were decorated with flowers and butterfly decorations that the twins had made. Mr. Wong's cake was a masterpiece. 3 tiers covered in fondant butterflies that looked ready to take flight. Their classmates arrived, filling the garden with excited chatter. But the most touching moment came when Officer Park unveiled a surprise. He found some of May's old paintings in storage and had them framed. Now they hung on the garden walls, surrounding the party with their mother's art. "Look," Lily gasped, pointing to one painting. It showed two small butterflies emerging from their chrysalis, their wings still wet and new. The date on the painting was just before the twins were born. Mai had painted it while waiting for their arrival. During the party, something extraordinary happened. As their friends sang "Happy Birthday," a whole swarm of butterflies descended, dancing around the twins as they blew out their candles together. Even the garden staff stood amazed, saying they'd never seen anything like it. Later, as the party wound down, the twins sat together on a garden bench, sharing the last piece of cake. "Do you think Mom knew we'd find each other?" Lily asked softly. Tommy thought for a moment, then pointed to the butterflies still fluttering nearby. She must have. That's why she loved butterflies so much. They always know how to find their way home. Officer Park and the Wongs watched their children from a distance, their hearts full. What had started as a complicated situation had bloomed into something beautiful. Just like the butterflies that surrounded them, their family had gone through its own transformation, emerging stronger and more colorful than ever. 1 year had passed since the twins discovered their true connection. The autumn leaves were turning golden again, just like the day they first met at school. Both families gathered in the Wong's backyard for their special anniversary celebration, not just of the twins' reunion, but of two families becoming one. The backyard was transformed with twinkling lights and colorful paper lanterns. Mr. Wong had outdone himself again with the food, preparing a feast that combined both families' favorite dishes. The amazing smell of his famous apple cinnamon rolls filled the air, mixing with the scent of Mrs. Wong's traditional dumplings. Officer Park stood by the grill, wearing a World's Best Dad apron that both kids had given him for Father's Day. He watched as Tommy and Lily chased each other around the yard, their laughter echoing through the evening air. They'd grown taller over the past year, but some things hadn't changed. They still moved in perfect sync, still shared those silent conversations that only they understood. "Remember when we were worried about how this would all work out?" Mrs. Wong said, joining Officer Park by the grill. They both smiled, thinking back to those nervous early days. Now, their unusual family arrangement felt as natural as breathing. The twins had worked on a special surprise for everyone. They disappeared into the house and came back carrying a large canvas covered with a sheet. "We've been working on this for weeks," Tommy announced proudly. Lily nodded, barely containing her excitement. "It's our family tree, but with a twist." When they pulled off the sheet, everyone gasped. The painting showed a massive butterfly-shaped tree. Each wing was filled with photographs and drawings, the Wong family on one side, the Park family on the other, but the bodies of the butterflies overlapped in the middle, where pictures of the twins, together and apart, told their story. At the very center, they'd painted a portrait of their mother, May. They'd used one of her old photos as reference, capturing her gentle smile and kind eyes perfectly. Around her, they'd painted dozens of small blue butterflies, like the ones from their birthday party. "Look closer," Lily said softly. Everyone leaned in and noticed something amazing. Hidden in the butterfly wings were tiny words. The twins had written their story, from separation to reunion, weaving it through the branches of their family tree. They'd included every person who had helped them along the way, their teachers, their friends, even Dr. Chen, who had helped them process their feelings. As the sun began to set, Officer Park brought out his guitar, something he hadn't touched since Mai passed away. But watching his children grow over the past year had awakened something in him. He started taking lessons again, remembering how much Mai had loved when he played. The twins sat on either side of him as he strummed the first few chords of an old lullaby, the one he and Mai used to sing to them when they were babies. To everyone's surprise, both Tommy and Lily knew the melody. "We remember it," they exclaimed together. "From when we were little." The whole family sat together under the stars, sharing stories and dreams. Mr. Wong talked about opening a small bakery, inspired by all the special moments he created through his baking. Mrs. Wong shared her plans to write a children's book about twin butterflies finding each other against all odds. As the evening grew late, the twins curled up together on the porch swing, tired but happy. They'd started a new tradition of spending 1 week at each house, and tomorrow they'd be switching again. But now, instead of feeling torn between two homes, they felt doubly blessed. You know what Mom's painting in the butterfly garden meant? Tommy whispered to his sister. The one with the two butterflies coming out of their chrysalis. Lily nodded sleepily. It means that sometimes you have to go through big changes to become who you're meant to be. Their parents watched from the doorway as both children drifted off to sleep, still holding hands. The past year had taught them all that family isn't about matching last names or living under the same roof. It's about the love that connects you, the strings of the heart that pull you together, no matter how far apart you may start. Above them, in the clear night sky, 2 shooting stars streaked past, moving in perfect synchronization. Just like the twins below, just like the butterfly wings in their painting, just like the love that had brought them all together.